Welcome to part 3 of the Chapter 18 video on the Great Recession. What we're going to do now is discuss what the U.S. could do to try to deal with this tremendous recession that we were in. The unemployment rate reached 10%, which means that the cyclical unemployment rate was 5.5%. That most of our unemployment was cyclical. So there's two schools of thought on how to deal with this. And this is going to be review, but this is the two ways to view a recessionary gap. So what I've drawn in black here is where we are initially, according to the classical economists. The real GDP is less than the natural, as you see here, and the unemployment rate is more than 4.5%. So that's where our economy begins. We're in a short-run equilibrium, but our economy is producing less than our long-run potential. Because there's so many people unemployed, wages drop. It may take a little while. It may take a while to move towards the long run, but eventually wages will drop because there's so many people unemployed that if you want to hire somebody, it's easy. You can pay them less. So wages drop. As a result, because wages drop, the businesses hire more workers, leading to more production. Okay. Short and aggregate supply increases because of the increase in production. CPI increases, decreases. So short and aggregate supply increases to the right, leading to a lower CPI, and real GDP equals a natural real GDP in the long run. Okay. Went through that really quickly. Don't refer to this when studying. It's just a way to give you a second look at this. We went through it in greater detail in the Chapter 9 handout and video. On the contrary, Chapter 10 we learned about Keynes, and Keynes represents a different viewpoint. Keynes believes that the government should get involved. So if the economy is in a recessionary gap, he believes it looked like this, with our real GDP here, producing less than our natural real GDP. The result of this is lots of idle resources, right? Idle resources are resources not in use. And so he believed the best way to get those idle resources in use is for the government to get involved. Specifically, the government should engage in expansionary fiscal policy by either increasing spending or cutting taxes, or maybe doing both. The goal here is that if the government engages in expansionary fiscal policy, people will end up with more disposable income, and thus they'll have more income and thus spend more. Okay? So on top of that, we'll get the multiplier effect. So the basic logic here is the government increases spending or cuts taxes by a little bit, leading to more aggregate demand. And then you'll get all those extra multiplier effects leading to a much larger increase in aggregate demand in total. As a result, our real GDP will increase, fixing our natural real GDP. Clearly, classical and Keynesian economics differ in terms of what they believe should happen, but I will point out that they're not so different. The classical economists are basically suggesting that if we wait long enough, the economy will fix itself. And Keynes is saying, let's not wait, let's deal with it now. So they're not necessarily at odds in terms of what they think will happen. They're more at odds in terms of what's important. Keynes is basically saying we need to get aggressive now to fix the problem now. So what did our government decide to do? Did they decide to do something classical, do nothing? Or did our government get involved and become more aggressive, which is what Keynes would suggest? Certainly, we took the Keynesian approach. It appears that our current policymakers in the U.S. are certainly more Keynesian oriented. So here was the response. It took a while. It took a while for the government to get involved because one problem with fiscal policy is that it takes a while to get anything done. To make new laws is a timely process that requires a lot of political bickering and a lot of lawmaking and a lot of arguments. So it took a while for anything to get passed, but eventually, in 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was passed. This was signed in February 2009, which was under Barack Obama's presidency, right at the beginning of his presidency. Initially, the plan was to pass this under Bush, but politicians were able to agree on any specific proposal, so it got pushed back, and eventually it got accepted and put into law February 17th, 2009. So now we're almost 10 years away from this American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This is the biggest spending bill passed by any government ever. And it's not close. This is the biggest spending bill passed by any government by far. Specifically, and this number you may find different values if you look online, but essentially about $831 billion, give or take a little bit, was spent. And the goal was to spend it between 2009 and 2019. So some of the projects here, actually haven't been completely finished yet. In fact, some of the projects haven't even started. One of the projects in this bill was to create a kind of a very fast railroad, essentially, a light rail, right, between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And that project hasn't even started. It may not even happen. So the plan was to spend about $831 billion. They may end up spending more or less. We'll see after it's all said and done. And tremendous amount of projects here. Just to give you some examples, okay? These are just examples. There are tons of things that were spent money on. For example, $40 billion on energy, on energy efficiency and renewable energy measures. So this is on things like researching renewable energy, implementing renewable energies, and so forth. So $40 billion, that's a lot, right? That's a lot of money. And that's just one of many, many projects that was spent on. Again, just giving you examples here. $47 billion to extend unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits usually run out after a certain period of time, and we extended those, basically believing that if you extend the unemployment benefits, people will have more disposable income, right? Because if they have some money instead of none, they'll be able to spend, and that will boost aggregate demand. So a lot of the projects look like this, very traditional projects that aren't too far out of the realm of what our government would typically do. But then we got some very strange ones here. And just to give you a couple of examples here, the $8,000 new homeowner credit. And I don't have this in my notes, so I don't know how much this came out to in total. But this $8,000 new homeowner credit basically meant if you were buying a home for the first time, the government would give you up to $8,000 towards your purchase of your house. And I think it was 10% of what you spent. So if I remember actually thinking about buying a house during this period, I think the house I was looking at, just a real small house in the place I was living, it was like $65,000. So the government would pay, the federal government, right, the U.S. government, would pay me $6,500 basically to do that transaction. The logic here is the housing market is in crisis. So if we can give some sort of incentive to get people to buy houses, that might spur economic growth. It's a pretty interesting strategy. And this is, again, something very different from what our federal government would normally do. Federal government doesn't normally give people incentive to buy specific goods. But in this case, they were to try to stimulate the economy and spur housing development. And then there's one more example I want to give you here. $3.4 million on a turtle tunnel. This is one I like to talk about because it shows the logic behind the federal government at the time. Apparently there was a road in Florida where turtles were crossing the street and getting run over by cars a lot. So the government spent money. And again, the federal government, the U.S. government, spent money on this project in Florida to try to allow turtles a place to cross under the road, to avoid accidents, and to maybe make it a little easier for these turtles to get to where they want to go. The whole logic behind any of these projects is to spur economic growth. This is very different from what the government usually does. The government is usually oriented in things like keeping people safe, protecting people from unexpected disasters like unemployment, okay? And certainly you see some of that here, right, with extended unemployment benefits. But what the government usually doesn't do is try to encourage people to buy certain stuff or go to specific areas of the country and try to stimulate growth in that specific area. That's not what the government usually does. But they did in this case. And even in Milledgeville, Georgia, even at Georgia College, we had a lot of projects that were paid for by the federal government. So actually money was spent at Georgia College by the federal government during this time period as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. In total, $831 billion, a tremendous amount of money. Short run, this probably helped us get out of the recession quicker. But what's the long-term cost? Well, there's a couple. So what can we learn from this? Most economists believe that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act slowed unemployment rates. There's a paper that surveyed economists and asked them about this, and 82% said they agree that it did help ease unemployment rates and get people back into employment. And half, literally, in the survey that I looked at, 50% of economists agreed that the costs, or rather the benefits, were greater than the costs. Meaning, economists are evenly split between whether this was worth it or not, but most agreed that it did something good. Okay, so it definitely helped, but we're not sure if it was worth the cost. And the cost is, number one, governmental debt. It's created a tremendous amount of governmental debt. Our government's in debt a lot of money. And we're going to talk about that after the second exam. And this increased the debt. Anytime the government's spending an extra $800 billion, that's a problem. That's debt, right? That's money that was financed. Meaning, when the government spent that money, it didn't do it via taxes. If the government had paid that $831 billion by raising taxes, that would have offset the whole plan. That would have completely eliminated the reason to do it. The reason the government is doing this project is to try to stimulate the economy through expansionary fiscal policy, to put more money into the consumer's hands. If it spent more money, but then taxed the consumers, that would completely negate the whole purpose, okay? So the way the government paid for this is by borrowing money. And so this creates governmental debt, okay? Another major cost is something called moral hazard for bailed out banks. One thing the government did in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is essentially take some of the really big failing companies in the United States and essentially bail them out. Some cases that meant that the government actually bought the failing companies or just took them over. Or in some cases, the government would give some money to these failing companies to help keep them afloat. The logic is that a company like, say, Bank of America, which probably would have gone under, if they fail, that's just too big of a problem for the economy. This isn't like a hot dog stand closing, right? If a hot dog stand closes, no big deal. But if Bank of America closes, that's a problem for our entire country, okay? Because if Bank of America fails, there's going to be people who have checking and savings accounts at Bank of America who never get their money back. This could be just an absolute disaster for the economy. So the government bailed them out. The problem here is potential moral hazard, and this is a new term for us. Moral hazard is essentially when the stakes of a transaction or the rules of a transaction cause one party to act in a manner that is problematic to the other party. This is the general definition of this term. This is when the rules of a transaction cause one party to act in a manner that is problematic to the other party. Moral hazard is, again, a very general term. It can be applied to a lot of things. And one really classic example is just about any form of insurance. So, for example, think about auto insurance, okay? What automobile insurance does is it protects me against an accident. So if I get into an accident, my insurance is going to pay for the damage. Think about what incentive that creates. If I don't have insurance and I get into an accident, I may lose my vehicle, I may have to pay for the other person's vehicle, and so I'm out a tremendous amount of money. But if I have auto insurance, if I get into an accident, that's going to recoup me for any of the damages to my vehicle and the other vehicle. So what auto insurance does in a way is incentivize accidents. It reduces the cost of an accident, which makes me more likely to get in an accident. It's kind of like saying, what if I gave you insurance on your grade? What if I said if you get below an 80 on the exam, I'm just going to give you an 80, okay? So if you do better than 80, great, I'll give you that score. But if you do worse than an 80, I'm just going to give you an 80. I'm going to pretend that's your grade. We'll call this grade insurance. What incentive does that create? It incentivizes you not to study, which is exactly what I don't want you to do, right? It's problematic to me. So the moral hazard here is if you bail out the banks, think about the incentives that this gives them. The banks, if they succeed, if their risks are rewarded, specifically, if they are able to do their subprime mortgages like they did and not have any problems, then the benefit is profits, okay? But if they fail, they're bailed out. So this is kind of like insurance against risky behavior. They do the subprime mortgages. If they succeed, great, big profits. If they do the subprime mortgages and they fail, well, the government's going to give them money and keep them alive. The concern here is that these bailouts will actually encourage the banks to be even riskier. So the potential problem here is, as the government may have incentivized risky behavior. And that is something that a lot of economists, when they're thinking about the costs here, a lot of economists are very worried about. If the government bails out these banks now, and they continue to do these risky behaviors, if they fail 10 years from now, we've now set a precedent for bailing out failing companies. So we may have incentivized them to be even riskier in the face of things like subprime mortgages. So where are we at today with the Great Recession? Well, the Great Recession, of course, is over. The Great Recession, in the literal sense, the recession was done, I believe, in 2010. But that being said, our economy was very, very slow recovery. Experienced a very, very slow recovery. So just for example, just to illustrate this point, I just went online and gathered some data. Here are the unemployment rates. I chose October of each of these years. Okay, so if you look at October 2008, all the way up to 2015, the unemployment rate went from 6.5%. All right, so that's kind of the early stages of this recession. We were literally in a recession in 2008, so we had 2 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP. And the unemployment rate is certainly above the natural. So here are the rates as we go through these years. Okay, this is what I found online. And this just illustrates just how wide-ranging this recession was. Now, the recession is confined to here. The recession, I believe, was in this period here, 2008 to, I think, right at the beginning of 2010. But you can see that even if you're not in a recession, the economy can be really bad. So this whole period, certainly during this whole range, we had a recessionary gap. Maybe it was ending around 2015. We get back to 5%, which is getting real close to normal. So this is a really wide-ranged recessionary gap, and the outcomes of this recessionary gap are just massive. And we're going to always think of this as an important game changer in our economy. People moved, a lot of movement of people because of this tremendous Great Recession. People generally were moving out of small towns. Opportunities in small towns seem to vanish. People are moving away from small towns to big cities. We've certainly seen that in Georgia. Atlanta's population growth continues to be positive, whereas small towns tend to be shrinking in size. People moving out of manufacturing cities, the Midwest, cities like Flint, Michigan, for example, huge decreases in their population as people moved out of these manufacturing centers. And it was all spurred on by the Great Recession and the recessionary gap that persisted after that. So even though this recession is something that began way back in 2007 or 2008, we just recently, just in the last few years, have officially moved past the recessionary gap, which lingered from that tremendous Great Recession. That's the end of chapter 18.